thank you all so much for joining today's Public Health Discovery Seminar Series. We are closing it out strong with Dr. Bree Davis as she presents her Public Health Discovery Seminar Series on understanding suicide and introduction to what the science tells us and why that matters. We're going to open it up for a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions and you have to do all, please feel free to drop those questions in the Q&A chat. We would love to answer those questions for you. And so I'm going to let Dr. Banks take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Cassie. And thank y'all all for hanging out with me this afternoon. Again, just like Cassie shared, we're going to talk a little bit about suicide this afternoon. And as we jump in, just a quick disclaimer, just a quick note that I know that many of us are either directly or indirectly impacted by suicide in one way or another. And this topic can be heavy for some. It may give space to enlighten and open up space to kind of talk about things we may have wanted to for a long time. Either way, if you need to take a step away or need a moment, please feel free to do that. I encourage all of you to take as good a care of yourselves as you possibly can. Only thing I would ask is that if you do need to step away, again, to take care of yourself or someone else, just shoot me a quick message. I'll have my email at the end. And just shoot me a quick message and let me know that you're okay. And if there's anything that I can do to support you or help you get connected to any support you may need. All right, friends, well, let's dig into it. So just a quick introduction. My name is Dr. Bree Banks Anger. I'm a clinical assistant professor here at Tulane in the School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine, and I work in the Department of Social, Behavioral, and Population Sciences. I am what's called a suicidologist. That's a title, ain't it? But ultimately, all that means is that I'm a researcher and clinician, practitioner, educator. I wear a couple different hats related to suicide prevention. So I was trained primarily as a clinician in graduate school as a behavioral health provider, excuse me, and but worked the majority of my career as both a clinical and translational researcher and also a program evaluator in doing suicide prevention at the community level. So much of my work has been in the kind of downstream area of public health and in behavioral health. But I have done quite a bit of work again in things like statewide surveillance, healthcare transformation, to create suicide safer healthcare systems. And I also have my own personal lived experience with suicide. So I'm an attempt survivor and loss survivor. And I share that as it absolutely impacts the way I approach suicide, the way I approach my research and my clinical work, training, education, all that kind of stuff. And we'll talk a little bit about what kind of lived experience is, what it means in the suicide prevention space, and if you or anyone that you know does have lived experience with suicide and you'd like to become more involved, either in advocacy or learning how to tell your story, or again, just getting connected with community within suicide prevention, please, please, please let me know. Then I'll tell you again, what are some strategies and ways to get connected and some of that stuff. So a handful of things that we'll talk about today. I already did the intro and brief bio. We'll take a minute to look inward a little bit and really think about what suicide means, if and to what degree and in what ways have we been personally or professionally impacted by suicide, and what are the things that we can do in the field as public health professionals and others. What's our role and what's our responsibility, and how can we actually kind of step into that space and make some change? I will share a bit about kind of what we know about suicide. I'll share a handful of key stats, but the thing that I'll spend most of the time on in that space is exploring a theory and a handful of kind of models for understanding suicide, and it's ultimately why someone might go on to die by suicide. And how ideation or thoughts of suicide connects to suicide behavior, all that kind of stuff. So we'll talk about that. And we'll also talk a little bit about kind of new directions in suicide prevention, kind of where we've been and where we're going, hopefully. And then we'll close and have time for questions and ideas and just a quick discussion. But again, I encourage you, if you have questions, thoughts, ideas, reactions, throw those in the chat. Throw up, questions, celebrations, thumbs up, anything, kind of as we're going. I will try to monitor the chat. I am terrible at doing two things at once, so y'all bear with me, but I promise I will do my best to get to all of your questions. And if I don't get to your questions here today, I will save the chat and make sure that I find a way to connect with you to get those questions answered for you. So again, just to reiterate a little bit, I have a master's in clinical mental health counseling, and my PhD is in a branch of educational psychology that's specifically focused on counselor education and supervision. So I got trained a bunch in how do clinicians learn? How do we move from being, again, maybe a new counselor, new social worker, new psychologist into a space of competency and confidence? And what are some of the learning mechanisms and the things that we can do to actually move folks along that kind of along that continuum. Again, 14 plus 15 now, I suppose, years in applied suicide research and program evaluation. Again, most of my research has been at the community level, within the clinic level, primarily working with folks with a variety of socioeconomic barriers. And again, my specialty is in clinical education and training, particularly in suicide prevention, because one of the things that we know is that many providers who work in the field get very, very little training and actually how to understand folks who might be at risk for suicide. We may get trained in how to do a screener or a risk assessment, but beyond that, many providers don't often have very clear direction of where we go next. And so I've spent a lot of time in that space, and also in kind of training members of the community. So how can we, again, bring good suicide prevention out from behind the walls of a clinic or a hospital or an emergency department and create more kind of holistic community-centered approaches for taking care of our own. Currently, like I said, I'm a clinical assistant professor here at Tulane. And I also sit on the board of directors for United Suicide Survivors International. We are an advocacy group that really specializes in enlivening and heightening the voices of persons with lived experience with suicide. And in the future, and kind of what I'm working on, and hopefully will continue to work on, is research in recovery focused suicide intervention. And I'll talk about that a little bit at the end of the day today, as well as, again, continuing to amplify the voices of those with lived experience and bringing those perspectives into research and treatment development and implementation of both public health upstream, downstream strategies to support folks that may have a wish to die. Again, just to reiterate, if you need to take a moment, please feel free to do so, and just let me know what I can do to support you. So like I said, I have lived experience with suicide, and over the past, I don't know, say 10 years or so in the community, or in the suicide prevention, suicidology kind of world, there has been more of a, I guess, a push or a call to action on both sides of the aisle, research and clinicians and folks with lived experience, again, to bring more of that perspective into why we do the work we do, how we do the work we do, and when we're doing research or building a treatment, how do we interpret that, and into what degree are we actually incorporating what folks who have either survived a suicide attempt or survived ideation or lost someone to suicide. When care goes well, what about it goes well? And when care doesn't, what got in the way? And what are the things that you need that we're not giving you? And so, again, for any of us here in the room, if you do have your own lived experience with suicide or really anything related to mental health, I would encourage you, again, to take time that you need and to think about if and in what way you can use that story and use that part of your voice. Again, like I said, with United Suicide Survivors International, we do a lot of work, again, in bringing folks in who maybe have a story but aren't sure how to tell it or aren't sure what avenue to take that down, or again, how to use that very real expertise to make things better for folks. So again, if you or someone you know may have lived experience with this, but aren't sure kind of how to get them connected or get yourself connected with this kind of side of the world, please let me know. all of the research we do, all of the even the implementation we do right alongside folks with lived experience, not just me. Again, because we know that how do I put this? If care doesn't work for the folks that it needs to work for, and give them what they need, then the science, it can be strong, but again, we have to pay very close attention to providing care and providing opportunities that folks feel comfortable and able and willing to pursue. And we've changed a lot in the suicide prevention community in that direction, primarily because we've started really to listen to the voices of those with lived experience. So I would ask us again, just briefly for a moment, have you, in your professional world, your personal world, ever been directly impacted by suicide? And again, that may take a lot of several different forms. It may have been a celebrity that you really admired or appreciated, like Anthony Bourdain comes to mind, who dies by suicide, and that really affected you, or a musician, or a family member, a friend, or you yourself. Um, and again, if you feel comfortable sharing, please feel free to do so in the chat. Um, or again, feel free to come off mute and share anything that you'd like. But I share this um, again to kind of get us in this position of thinking about who we are in relation to suicide prevention as people, both as individuals and as professionals. Um, because again, I think just statistically, the chances that we've never been impacted by suicide, I think, are very, very low. Um, and that is, again, largely because suicide is 100% a public health issue. We often, again, try to, I think, separate like suicide prevention initiatives and activities into downstream things like treatment, intervention, and upstream things like, again, awareness, increasing access to care, that kind of stuff. But suicide truly runs the full gamut of all things that public health touches. Like I said, most of my work has been in the more downstream kind of implementation, training, and education in the community and in providers, and then providing direct clinical care. But I had actually started studying suicide prevention before I experienced suicidality myself. And I was very fortunate in that, because again, I'd been connected with this community kind of academically and professionally, I had a better sense of kind of how to navigate the care system, what to look for, what to ask about. And I know that many of us don't. Um, and again, we'll talk about kind of access and equitability and a handful of things related to that kind of down the road. But suicide and suicide prevention do not live exclusively within the person that might be experiencing suicidality. There are a myriad of things that can either facilitate or obscure the opportunity to actually recover from being suicidal. And again, we'll talk about that in a little bit. But again, I would venture to guess that many of us, if not all of us, have been directly impacted, or at least indirectly impacted, by suicide in one way or another. I'm going to check the chat real quick, you guys. And thank y'all for sharing this. I I appreciate y'all's transparency. I'm so sorry to hear of the loss of your friend, and thank you for sharing yours as well. Good to see you here. And I'm so grateful that you got the help that you needed. And yes, like you said, when public figures pass away, it can shake us in several ways. I remember one of my favorite musicians, Chris Cornell. I don't know what just happened. Something fell out of my ceiling. Okay, we'll skip that for now. When Chris Cornell passed away, it hit me like a just a ton of bricks. Um, and I think for me in that is, we kind of where we are, we recognize all of the beauty or the art or the impact that they made on our lives. And then to know that they were suffering in this way that entire time, it it does, it hurts and it affects us. So again, thank y'all for sharing your own experiences. Um, and again, if and to what degree you need any support or help or just need a chat, I'll have my email again at the end and we'll make sure y'all have that. So please reach out if there's anything we can do to support you guys. So just a handful of some key stats that, again, I am happy to share, like CDC reports, all that kind of stuff with you guys. But I want to take a minute to talk about some things that are most, or I think particularly pressing or urgent, or at least kind of novel right now. So right now, we are currently living under the highest suicide rate that we've had since 1941, which is when we really started kind of recording those kind of data. And that average is about 14.3 people per 100,000 die by suicide every year. Within, as we look across kind of different demographics and those who are dying by suicide, we're seeing the most significant increase in African American women. Now, the base rate in African American women historically has been relatively low. Base rate for suicide is relatively low, which can make some of the data a little bit wonky or kind of hard to interpret. But what we've seen over the past probably about 3 years. I think that's when these data were pulled from. I can double check. But we're seeing the largest kind of year over year increase in African American women. And again, I would encourage us to think about the notion that suicide is not an experience that exclusively lives within the person. It's a transactional thing. We are people who live in the world. And as we all know, living in the world as it is now as a Black woman is not a particularly easy experience. Um, we've also seen an increase, a significant increase in suicide attempts. So on average in 2021, there were 1.7 million. This is the most recent data, kind of year over year released by the CDC. But again, 1.7 million suicide attempts on average per year. And what we're seeing is, again, kind of changes in demographic groups. We're seeing folks in younger and younger demographics attempting suicide. I've, again, been in care systems when there were suicide attempts in kiddos as young as 6. And again, we know that in geriatric populations, the suicide rate is also incredibly high. And one of the things that is, I mean, it's unfortunate, but it is very interesting that so we know in suicide prevention, the primary milieu where most folks go to get care, if they do, and that's a big kind of asterisk there, is in emergency departments. Typically because that might be the only place available, or we don't understand or know that there are other avenues and other opportunities to get care earlier in the process, maybe before we move into a full crisis event or after an attempt. And I share that because one of the things that we have found over really the past 5, 6 years is that the experience of going to the emergency room to ameliorate suicide may not be very beneficial. In fact, it may be iatrogenic. And again, that varies from emergency department to emergency department. There is a wide degree of variability, excuse me, in how emergency departments approach suicide, how they're staffed for suicide, how they're trained in responding to suicide. But for the most part, many emergency departments just are not built to really contain and provide kind of triage and emergent support for folks at risk for suicide. And so what typically happens is, I mean, we move into the ED. We might get a screener, we might get a risk assessment, and if we're super lucky, we might get what's called a safety plan. But again, the degree to which that actually happens varies quite a bit. But other than that, may get a referral, might not. So what happens is the experience of even going to the ED can be traumatic, can be actually harmful for folks at risk for suicide. And again, this comes from many folks with lived experience who share that within the emergency department, may be treated as I'm just taking up a bed, or I'm not in actual crisis right now. There's someone who literally just got shot and that's where attention needs to go. And so those kind of immediate needs of someone who's in a suicide crisis, like again, connection, being able to share your story, being able to have that experience of being suicidal normalized with compassion, may not be offered. And so suicide risk after discharge from the emergency department actually increases. And again, there's some variance in these data, but um, a study came out, I think 2023, 2024, that showed that risk was about 600 times higher for a fatal reattempt after discharge from the ED. So as we again think about kind of where there is need, where there are opportunities, where more research needs to be done, where more implementation needs to be done, and how we approach care in these periods of transition, we call them care transitions. How crazy is that? From emergency department to outpatient or moving into the emergency department, these kind of times of transition of care are often incredibly high risk periods. And so as we kind of think about what can we do, what are our opportunities, that's a very, very big one. So just a quick poll to kind of run us through what we think we know about suicide and what we actually know about suicide. So if y'all wouldn't mind kind of playing along with me in the chat, just throw in for each of these if you think it's a myth or fact, and we'll go kind of one by one, and I'll explain kind of as we go. So the first of which, women are more likely to attempt suicide, but men are more likely to die by suicide. Do we think that's myth, fact? Then y'all can feel free to come off mute or throw your thoughts in the chat. Yep, it looks like we're getting a consensus here, guys. Yes, that is actually a fact. Women are more likely to attempt suicide, but typically, why does this happen? Men typically use means, the ways that they go on to die by suicide, that are more violent or more likely to end in death on the first time. So the means and the mechanisms that women often use to die by suicide have a higher, on average, survivability. So the likelihood that they may attempt but survive is much higher. And again, that's due primarily to the means that they use. The second, well done, you guys. Myth or fact: the majority of behavioral health professionals receive training in evidence-based treatments for suicide. What do you think about that? Got some myths, a handful of facts. Yeah, well, that is in fact a myth, unfortunately. Again, I was in school for 100 years and for a mental health degree, and I received one training in how to do a risk assessment that wasn't even an evidence-based risk assessment. And also got trained in how to do what's called a safety contract, which is essentially like you sign this paper and so you agree to not attempt suicide. And that's also iatrogenic, does not work and makes people worse. So again, where we are in kind of training providers and preparing the workforce who may actually be the ones on the front line to respond to suicide, there is tons of opportunity. One, because there are actually a handful of specific interventions that have been evidenced to work for folks at risk for suicide, that are suicide specific, that focus primarily on suicide. And I'll tell you all about one in particular at the end of the presentation today. And they again have been proven to be effective in many ways. But access to training in those interventions is often very, very difficult. It's expensive. The training is often, several days or over there's one in particular, dialectical behavior therapy, where full training lasts at least a year, which again, for many providers who are working in the world, again, maybe in community-based behavioral health or in local hospitals, whatever, we don't have that kind of time for training. The places we work often don't have the kind of infrastructure to provide us that kind of training. And so many providers were just kind of left to figure it out on our own, which can be hard, especially if training is not particularly accessible and is cost prohibitive. Moving on. So most people who die by suicide never tell anyone that they're considering ending their life. Myth or fact on that one, you guys? Yeah, got some myth, and you're absolutely right. this is a myth. Many people who do go on to die by suicide actually do share, especially if they're asked directly. So just the simple question of, so I've noticed some change in you. It seems like you're going through it a little bit. Are you thinking about killing yourself? Are you thinking about ending your life? And there are some phenomenal kind of community level trainings. One is QPR, another is Assist. Assist is a more expansive training for, again, folks that aren't providers. Some providers actually take and say that it helps them as well. But QPR is a 2-hour training, and again, it walks through what are some, again, key things that we need to know and that we need to look for, and ways to ask that question in a way that's not stigmatizing and, again, elicits honesty and transparency on behalf of the person that might be suicidal. And I know that sometimes asking that question can feel intimidating, but one of kind of a myth like attached to this myth. Yeah, thank you, Rachel. That's awesome. That asking someone if they're suicidal might make them more suicidal. That is a complete myth. One, dying by suicide is way harder than that, and it takes a lot more for a person to get to a position where they could go on to die by suicide. And I'll talk about that in a moment as well. But we don't have that much power. Just asking a person a question is not going to completely move them into a suicide attempt. It won't make them worse. And what the research tells us is that it actually helps when, again, folks feel seen, folks feel as though you're a place that they could share this with because you've been paying attention and you were, again, competent enough to ask that question directly. So again, if you are noticing something in a friend or a loved one or a colleague, and you think they may be struggling, the best thing you can do is show up, ask the question, and sit next to them while they tell you what their answer is. And last but not least, once someone decides to die by suicide, there is little that can be done to change that decision. What do y'all think? Myth? Fact? I see you, Sam, that exclamation, and you got it. Yep, yep, that is absolutely a myth. We know, again, this is directly from the research, that even those who who attempt suicide and go on to die, mostly this is from folks who have survived attempts, they still experience a pretty strong degree of ambivalence around living and dying. And it's not so much like a pros and cons. It's not that easy, but what we've found in much of our research and just in the field is that many folks who go on to die by suicide don't die because they crave dying. Many people go on to die by suicide because they are unable to continue to live their life as it is. Life has become unlivable. It is impossible for me to live this life. And I'll talk about in a minute why that might be. But what we've learned is, and especially in kind of recovery oriented and recovery focused suicide prevention, that if the conversation moves away from we're going to ask you to just stay safe for the sake of staying safe and continue to live this life without any changes in it, then, and instead focusing on what are the things in your life that you would need to have changed today in order for you to continue to live it. So we're not just asking for a person to kind of just grin and bear it and suffer through life. I don't ask patients to suffer. I'm not going to do that. What I see our role is, and kind of what I see my role is in helping folks understand that, one, life is changeable. There are things that we can do to make life more livable and to make it actually rewarding in ways for them that are meaningful for them. And that's where suicide prevention and treatment and intervention can really live. That, again, these things do not happen in a vacuum. They do not happen exclusively within a person. Suicide happens because they've had to live a life that is unlivable. So what are the things that we can do in public health and otherwise, again, to help folks find avenues and strategies to make their lives more livable? And thank y'all for participating with me in that. I appreciate it. So we're going to pivot just a little bit and talk about a theory that explains kind of why people die by suicide. This comes from a handful of researchers. One is Kim Van Orden out of University of Rochester, and the other is Dr. Thomas Joyner out of Florida State. I've got a rogue hair here that's tickling my face. Sorry, you guys. And so with Thomas, he also has lived experience. His father died by suicide. And so he set in his career, he set out to understand why. He could not understand why his dad died, why anybody would die by suicide. How is it possible that someone could go on to take their own life? And so he did a ton of research on this. This model is the most cited, most evidence-based, most supported in the literature for kind of understanding and being able to decipher among, again, different degrees of suicidality, and to kind of understand categorically what are the things that happen in folks that experience suicidal ideation, and in those who experience suicidalation and attempts, and then those go on to die. And through some of his research, he was really able to kind of pin down that there are a handful of things that are present within those who go on to die by suicide that we, as a field, both clinically and otherwise, should pay closer attention to and incorporate more into how we are doing risk assessment and screening. And I'll share briefly that now, right, the way that we kind of approach suicide is, I'm sure we've all heard of things like warning signs, things like risk factors. And I remember I was being trained as a clinician in like risk assessment. This is how I got trained initially was like, look for warning signs for suicide. Like, well, what are they? Turns out there are 3,674, I think is the number, but roughly 4,000 warning signs have been, risk factors have been associated with suicide in one way or another. Now, I'm glad to know it, and fine. And I don't know about y'all, but I can't remember 4,000 of anything. And so, again, from a clinical perspective, if I'm the one sitting in the chair, or if I'm a pastor and I'm working with someone, or if I'm a teacher and I've got a student that I see struggling, or if I'm, working in the community, wherever I am, it would be very, very, very hard for me to kind of run through this Rolodex of 4,000 warning signs and pick out the ones that seem to be rising to the top. And part of why that's a problem, one, it's just too many to remember. Before this work came out, there was never really any kind of indicator for which of those warning signs were kind of red warnings and which ones were yellow warnings, right? We didn't know which ones actually were more predictive or more strongly associated with going on to die by suicide. And so in this work, what Kim Van Orden and Thomas Joyner did was to really kind of sort through those 4,000 signs, and identify what are the ones that are the strongest, which are the ones that have the strongest association. And they did this through, again, kind of big statistical models in addition to some qualitative work. And so the methodology for how this theory was developed and has continued to kind of evolve and change really kind of runs the gamut from very basic research all the way to, again, very deeply qualitative lived experience kind of research. And so what they found was there are just, instead of 4,000, there are three things. There are just three things that actually can predict a suicide death or highly lethal attempt. And those three things are perceived burdensomeness, thwarted belongingness, and acquired capability for suicide. And I'll talk about each one in just a second. But what this model essentially posits is that when perceived burdensomeness and thwarted belongingness are present, that's when suicidal ideation happens. That's when the desire to die happens. That's when planning for an attempt happens. But when we add this third factor called acquired capability for suicide, that is when we see suicide attempts and deaths. That's when we see highly lethal attempts. So using a means that is likely to end in death on the first attempt. And it's only when all of these three things are present do we typically see a suicide death. And I'll talk through kind of what each one of these things means briefly. So the first of which is called thwarted belongingness. And I'll let y'all kind of read that quote. This comes from Thomas's book. It's called Why People Die by Suicide. It's a great primer on this theory and the kind of the some of the science to suicide prevention. Get on Amazon. It's like $11. Great read. And he shares again how some of his research came about and how some of these show up in patients and in the world. So thwarted belongingness, essentially, what the ITS suggests is that we as humans are deeply social creatures, and one of the things that we need, kind of one of our basic life needs, is connection and community. And when we lose that, that leads to a thing called thwarted belongingness. And kind of how this came about in the research was he again was just looking again these big population models of who's going on to die, and then looking through death records, all sorts of stuff, kind of psychological autopsies, and found that many people who go on to die again experience this sense of not feeling as though they belong to anything. They don't belong here in the world. They don't belong in their community, or they don't have a community to whom they belong or to which they can belong. Um, they may have experienced a recent loss that they from which they've gotten a sense of belonging. So we see when folks leave the military, we see when folks retire, we see when folks experience a divorce or a death loss in the family, or even a suicide loss in the family. These things that threaten our sense of belonging to something or someone can really again drive feelings of isolation and hopelessness. So thwarted belongingness is the first. And kind of the opposite end of that, what is if thwarted belongingness is a cause for suicide, what is a remedy? Connection. And that can happen in a lot of different ways. Talk about that in just a second. So perceived burdensomeness, and this one was really interesting when it kind of hit the field. So we have all likely heard in media, in movies, on the news, and somewhere maybe in our own families, or maybe we may believe this ourselves, that suicide is a deeply selfish act, that we're not thinking about who we're leaving behind or who we could be hurting by dying. In the suicidal mind, the person who goes on to die by suicide or experiences the desire to die truly, truly, truly believes that the world would be better off without them, that their death would be more meaningful and beneficial for others than their life has ever been. So it's there's this kind of equation, there's a math that they do that, okay, sure, I've got family, they may miss me for a time, but because I have made life so hard for them with all these medical bills and the reattempts and going to rehab and failing and not having a job, not being able to get on my own 2 feet, that my life is the thing that is the burden. I am the burden. And while it might hurt for a time, it's almost kind of like ripping off a band-aid, that if I take myself out of their life, their lives would be easier. So they truly believe that they are doing the world and those that they love a favor by taking themselves out of the world. So what is the antidote to that? So if I'm a burden, and if I only kind of take from the world and I don't give anything back in a positive way, the antidote is giving, is a sense of contribution. It's a sense of competency, that not only do I belong in the world, but while I'm in it, I can mean something. I can give back something good. I can be a source of strength or positivity or goodness, just some benefit, that my existence has some sense of net benefit, rather than only taking from the world and experiencing nothing but pain and suffering that entire time. And last but not least, and this is the thing that really kind of blew the top off of everything, and what Thomas and Kim found here is essentially the idea that dying by suicide is very, very difficult, and not everyone can do it. Just about everyone can experience ideation in one way or another. Again, life gets hard enough. I'm sure we've all felt like a burden at some point. We've all felt like we didn't belong at some point. And not to say that that automatically meant you were suicidal, but these things can evolve, and we can all likely imagine ourselves being in a place where they felt like they were a burden or didn't have belonging to the degree that they may not want to be here anymore. But with acquired capability, this is the kind of that third factor that separates those who actually go on to attempt and die. Acquired capability essentially says that there are a handful of things required in order for an attempt to even be possible. And it largely has to do with a sense of tolerance, or again, being kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Exposed to what we call painful and provocative events. So that shows up in two ways. One is kind of a high degree of pain tolerance, both psychological pain tolerance and physical pain tolerance. So when we think about highly lethal attempts and death, they often require a relatively violent means, like a firearm, jumping from a high surface. There's usually physical harm involved um, in those means of dying. And so again, there has to be a willingness to tolerate that kind of pain, to tolerate the physical things that your body will try to do to preserve and save itself during the attempt. And we know that also again from the lived experience literature, that in the midst of an attempt, your body may very well try to fight you very hard to not let you do this. And so being able to push past all that, not everyone can do. So when there has to be again this tolerance, this capacity to tolerate pain. But another is more of a kind of like a psychological kind of acculturation to these kind of things, and that's like a psychological familiarity, almost to degrees of expertise in death and dying. And so in their work, what Thomas and Kim looked at was, let's look at the populations and folks who actually go on to die across occupations or across kind of just personal histories. And again, we see very high rates of suicide within doctors, um, first responders, folks in the military. These are all groups of people who often confront or are acquainted with or familiarized with death and dying in one way or another. Medical professionals physically know how the body dies. Military and first responders, again, may have expertise in firearms. They may have, again, seen extensively violent or, again, kind of provocative events that indicate mortality. Again, we're around death and dying often in those fields. And so, and another kind of that kind of acculturates us and familiarizes us with these ways and means of dying, or if we either have a previous attempt, or someone in our close circle has an attempt or had died by suicide. And those are some of the biggest predictors of those that actually go on to die by suicide. And so when we kind of look across, before I move on, so the antidote to acquired capability is what we call mean safety. So we want to talk to folks and understand, if you were to die today or whenever you're ready to die, what is your plan? What is your means? How would you go about doing that? And is there a way that we can create more space, either physical space? So I lock up my guns, or I give them to someone else, or I put my meds in a lockbox and have someone else have the key, whatever that might be. So either with space or with time. So it would take me longer to access the means that I need. Doing these kind of mean safety practices can absolutely prevent attempts from happening in the midst of a crisis. They are very, very effective at actually preventing attempt and death. And what they don't do is necessarily prevent reattempt and death, or actually resolve or treat the desire to die, the thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness doesn't do that. So there's more work to be done, but mean safety is one of the most effective mechanisms at actually preventing a suicide death. Do you have any questions about this? Y'all feel free to throw them in the chat, or we can hold questions until the end. But if you have questions, throw them in the chat, remember them, and we'll talk about them a little bit at the end. So as you probably noticed, all three of those factors are individual level things, right? It's how I feel like a burden, it's how I feel like I don't belong, and it's based on my kind of personal experience with painful and provocative events. And in kind of psychology, behavioral health world, that's where most of us live. Um, that is all good, Kyle. And if you happy to Kylie, sorry, I can't, my vision's really good. Happy to share you the slides, or if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thank you for joining. Um, so when so we live in downstream. We think that if we kind of again attend to some of the psychological things, then we'll be fine. However, what we know, obviously, especially in public health, is that both health and lack of health are not caused, nor are they solely resolved at the individual level. That's part of why public health even exists, right? We know that cancer or any health issue, right, is again it's an amalgam of sometimes a lifetime's worth of things that have led to a particular disease, or depending on kind of who we are, where we are in the world, getting treatment to whatever is kind of ailing us may be very, very difficult, which makes us worse. Um, and so these things are just as true for suicide. In public health, we often talk about social determinants of health, and that's really what we're looking at here. And that hasn't been a super strong presence in suicide prevention for a long time, but I'd say in the past 5 years or so, the lens is starting to shift a little bit. And we've always looked at like kind of population stuff and high level data like epi data, but looking through those data and trying to understand again these kind of socio-structural things that can inhibit or facilitate actually resolving suicide and preventing suicide, that's a relatively new frontier in suicide prevention. So a couple things again from that kind of body of literature that I want to share briefly. Let me check time. Oh, I'm running out already. Okay, I'll go through this quickly. One of which is health equity and access. Very few providers are actually trained in suicide specific treatment. And as we know, access to healthcare in general is dwindling, or at least decreasing at a rate that we certainly don't want to see. And we know that there are several subpopulations that are at particularly high risk for suicide. And do they have providers that, again, can affirm their identities and affirm their care? And if not, we often don't engage in care. So that's one of the biggest problems in suicide prevention is that most people never seek behavioral health care, those that actually go on to die. And again, a similar social determinant of health, stigma and culture. Suicide is among, if not the most stigmatized health condition that's out there. Again, it's AIDS and other kind of sexually related disorders. But suicide is highly, highly stigmatized, and seeking help for suicide is incredibly inhibited by internalized stigma, or again stigma in the community where there are no resources because we don't talk about that, we don't touch that, we're not allowed to touch that, which again may be derived culturally, interpersonally, who knows, but these are huge things and opportunities for us to kind of move in as public health professionals. Another is place and time. So, like I said earlier, most care for suicide happens in the ED. It does not have to. Some of the work that we're doing incorporates peers and community-based models. So I would encourage us all to think about how could we make suicide prevention more accessible, and again, if we're rooting it in kind of recovery and social determinants and creating spaces where folks can access care, can access community to again create belonging, what are strategies that we can do? Again, we people that are suicidal are not fragile. They're not going to die because you ask them about suicide. They don't necessarily belong in padded rooms and inpatient units. Some may need that, or some may need inpatient care, and we want to be sure to get them that. But if we think more upstream and kind of earlier in the process of developing the desire to die, where can we intervene? Where can we be that we're not? And again, last kind of plug for lived experience. Um, the voices of those with lived experience are absolutely critical to improving the way that suicide care actually works. And so I'm working on kind of starting a bit of a group kind of consortium for folks in public health and in behavioral health that are researchers or practitioners or providers that also have lived experience, in ways that we can kind of bring those minds together to again advocate for ourselves and advocate for the voices of lived experience in the way that we do research and deliver care. So to kind of close us out, one of the things that I just want to kind of leave us with a quote of, and it's my quote. I guess I didn't have to put it up here, but um, just not dead is not good enough. So when we think about suicide prevention, we've often thought pretty exclusively on safety, that our job is to prevent the death, just prevent the death from happening. What happens after that is not our problem. And I think that may explain, at least in part, why the suicide rate is not changing. Suicide does not happen in a vacuum, and it also does not go away after the passage of a crisis. Many people who experience suicidality do it over an extensive period of time. Again, I'll share with my experience. I experienced recurrent suicidality. So it goes away for a time, it might come back, goes away, comes back. I'm fortunate in that I know how to handle it, get the support that I need, so I'm fine. But many people don't. Um, and so for the longest time, we've been focused pretty heavily on safety. But in the research that we're doing, a colleague, Dr. Jennifer Lockman at UAB, we do research on an intervention that we created that is what we call recovery focused, that incorporates social determinants of health to, again, not only get a picture for what are the things that might make you die today, but we also ask and provide intervention around what are the things that can help you live tomorrow. And so as we kind of think about what suicide prevention is and the directions and kind of where we can go, what we're learning in this kind of recovery-based intervention, I have the citation for our first paper, we've got a handful coming out pretty soon, is that when we provide kind of therapeutic spaces for folks to maybe not be ready to not die today. That's okay. If you're not ready to say you can't, you'll live forever today, that's fine. Where are you? Where can you be? We're going to be right here with you. And so this intervention again is more strengths focused, it's more kind of positivist in its orientation, and was built right alongside folks with lived experience. And what we found is we've had no patients drop out in this. Some of this is from studies, like actual clinical trials, and some is just from kind of routine clinical data at the suicide specialty clinic at UAB. But what we found is we've had no dropouts. And this is in a sample of more than 250 folks. We've had 0 deaths or reattempts. We had 1 hospital readmission, but there was not no reattempt and no death. Folks are actually connecting to care longer term after they're discharged from us. And in some of our follow-up data, we're finding that folks are actually, again, their core kind of needs related to those, both the interpersonal needs and those related to the social determinants, they are able to meet those. We're seeing folks get housing, we're seeing folks get jobs, we're seeing folks reconnect with family. And so we're seeing long-term recovery, at least again, when long-term we'll see, it's a relatively new intervention. But the findings that we have so far are pretty promising. So if you want to learn more about what recovery-focused suicide prevention can look like and kind of where we're heading, either come to the American Association of Suicidology Conference in May. I'll be there presenting on this in St. Louis, or read this paper. And we have a bunch of other papers coming out very soon too. Okay, that's it. I'll shut up. I know I did not leave enough time for questions, but I apologize, Cassie. But yeah, any questions, thoughts? Y'all go to town.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Banks. There's no rush. I really enjoyed your public health discovery seminar series. So at this time, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat or in the Q&A chat if you want to be anonymous. But thank you so much, Dr. Banks. Like I said, I really enjoyed it. I really wasn't even looking at the time.
Oh, wow. That's great to hear. And thank you, Lorena. And again, if y'all have any questions or want to learn more about anything related to suicide prevention, there's my email. I'm happy to throw that in the chat too. If I can get my computer to work, that'd be cool.
I got you, Dr. Banks. I just dropped it in the chat.
Sure do, man. I need you in all my classes, Cassie. I just need you in all my meetings. I never know what I'm doing. But yeah, again, thank y'all so much for attending. And if you do have any questions, please let me know. I'm around actually writing a grant to actually put the Thrive intervention in the University Medical Center here, and to try it out there. See you, Lorena. That's great, Lorena. If you have, if you want to share that paper, or if you want to talk more about that, please let me know. I'd love to learn more. And you're right, the suicide rate among nurses and physicians absolutely spiked during COVID, especially early COVID. It was a very, very hard time. And so some of what we're also studying is what are the things that we can do within healthcare systems to change culture to not only better support our patients, but to better support providers so that they are comfortable, they have the time and the resource to have conversations with patients that may be at risk, and again, to be able to take care of themselves, um, and take care of one another and get help when they need it. We know that again, especially with nurses and physicians, stigma with suicide is still super, super, super high. And so again, part of our job, I think, is creating spaces where, you know, we show up with what we have and who we are, and we're not judged for that, and we're supported and we're welcomed. Um, and again, suicide is not an indicator of weakness. It is not an indicator of giving up. It is an indicator of having lived a life that was impossible. Um, when life is not very good to you, it's very hard to be good back to it. So I will leave y'all with that. Um, but if there are no questions, Cassie, I guess we can wrap, but I'll leave that to you.
Yeah. So again, thank you all so much for joining today's Public Health Discovery Seminar Series with Dr. Bree Banks. I'm going to give you back 2 minutes of your time. Again, thank you all so much. You all have a wonderful holiday. Wherever you are, I hope that you are warm. And if you're in a cold area, I hope that you are bundled up. Thank you so much, Dr. Banks, for your Public Health Discovery Seminar Series. Hope to see you all again in the spring when we kick off next semester's Public Health Discovery Seminar Series. But thank you all so much, and y'all take care.
Thank y'all.
Bye.
See ya.